If you are or will be a family caregiver, this episode is for you. Did you know that over 53 million Americans provide unpaid care to a family member, often neglecting their own health and well-being? Many report high levels of stress and burnout. It's time we address the often overlooked need for caregiver self-care. Today, we're exploring a trauma-sensitive approach to incorporating movement into your daily routine. Our guest will share practical strategies to help caregivers prioritize their own physical and mental well-being, even in the midst of their demanding roles. Welcome to Aging Together, a podcast dedicated to exploring the challenges and opportunities of caring for our aging communities. I'm your host, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, an occupational therapist with specialty certifications in geriatric care, dementia, and fall prevention. In this podcast, I interview guests who are experts in their fields or can share their experiences with caregiving. Together with the guest speakers, we dive into a wide range of topics including health and wellness, care planning, caregiving, and more. I hope you'll join me on this journey. Let's navigate aging together. Hi everyone, I'm your host Pooja, and you're listening to Aging Together. This month, we're diving into the role of movement in daily self-care for family caregivers. To review this topic, I have the privilege of interviewing Janis Isaman. As the founder of My Body Couture, a one-on-one private movement studio, Janis is a trauma-sensitive movement specialist focused on providing customized, personalized, body-focused services to clients with chronic pain, illness, injuries, and other movement limitations. She is a leader in approaching mental health and wellness from a body-first lens. Her trauma credentials include the compassionate injury psychotherapy approach developed by Gaber Mate, Trauma Center trauma-sensitive yoga, Somatic Experiencing International developed by Peter Levine, and Trauma Research Foundation's Traumatic Stress Certificate program with Bessel van der Kolk. Some of her exercise, bodywork, and movement certifications include Stott Pilates, Yamuna Body Rolling, Paul Grilly Yin Yoga, Leslie Kaminoff Principles and Practice, Rainbow Yoga, and Critical Alignment Yoga and Therapy. She has additional designations from Precision Nutrition and the Institute of Integrative Nutrition, and has completed coursework in Forest Yoga, Functional Synergy, and Eat, Breathe, Thrive. Janis is known for her whole body approach to movement, focused on addressing the root cause of limitations and aesthetic concerns. Her practical, functional, and discipline-agnostic approach blends physical and evidence-based mental health modalities into a relatable, innovative, and effective body sustainability program. This approach offers clients education and usable tools and has changed how thousands have related to the experience of their own bodies. Janis is a keynote speaker and has been a guest on over 250 podcasts since 2020. She is an award-winning writer for Elephant Journal and has been quoted as a health expert in Reader's Digest, Prevention, Women's Health, Cosmopolitan, Working Mother, Spark People, MyFitnessPal, and Beachbody. She also leads professional teacher training to help other movement professionals gain certifications and to help studios add new modalities to their programming. In her personal life, she is a mother and passionate community volunteer with the Calgary Stampede, 17th Avenue Business District, Heritage Park, and Kids Up Front. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Alberta. Together, we're discussing a trauma-sensitive approach to incorporating movement into your daily routine as a family caregiver. Please join me in welcoming Janis to the show. Hi, Janis. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello. I'm super excited to talk to you again.
Yes, I am too. This is a topic we have not covered yet before, so I'm really excited to hear from you, and I think it's going to be a wonderful topic.
Amazing. This is one that's close to my heart, so I'm really happy to chat.
Thank you. So without getting into the details, because I know we briefly talked about this when we first chatted, but can you share a bit about your background and how you became a trauma-sensitive movement specialist?
Yes. So the first thing that probably needs to be said, and I'll just keep this really brief, but I have had the experience of being a caregiver myself. So that's why I say that this one is close and near and dear to my heart. So I'm kind of familiar on a personal level with how challenging it is personally in our body, in our energy levels, in our spirit, in our mental capacities, everything, to really do that day in and day out and not have it impact other areas of our life. And then when we move into my professional area, I'm a trauma sensitive movement specialist. And what that really means is that it's the intersection of what movement and mental health looks like. And for anybody who is working with caregiving, obviously those words sound like, the most amazing thing ever, but actually putting that into practice is really difficult. So my background is one of, I come from like a non-athletic background. I was the worst in all of the things when it came to physical education, right from the gate, just not naturally inclined that way. So that might also bring some comfort to people who are like, oh Lord, we're talking about exercise and movement and oh no. So, on a lot of levels, I kind of understand how really challenging it is to integrate and incorporate exercise and movement into our daily lives. That's actually how I got started in this area in the first place. It was what we would have, formerly called mind body exercise. That ended up kind of being the doorway that opened everything for me. And I'm really being specific with yoga and Pilates. Those were kind of the first movements that I ever did where I was like, oh, I can do this and I like it. So I still use those tools, but then as time evolved, I moved into trauma work and really that's a big word, but what it means is that we encounter or have encountered overwhelming experiences for our body. So things that it's hard for our body to process and move through. And that can actually include caregiving, either in the present or in the past. It can include relational exposure. So, if somebody listening is caregiving for a parent that perhaps they didn't have the greatest relationship, that can actually be quite traumatizing. And so it's really connecting with our bodies, our capacities, our sensation, and trying not to, enact coping mechanisms, dissociation, etc. Easier said than done. But, I got into it because I needed it myself at the end of it.
Sure. I think you really touched on a few points on this next question, but what is trauma sensitive movement and how does it differ from traditional exercise programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So trauma sensitive movement, just to kind of start, that is actually a trademark term. The word's trauma sensitive. So anybody that you ever encounter who is a trauma sensitive yoga or movement or whatever comes after that has likely gone through, and you should always check, the Trauma Center Trauma Sensitive Yoga program. So that is a specific program. It's the same way that in our society, if you're a doctor, that means you have gone through a very specific program with specific educational protocols and principles, and you have to demonstrate that in order to graduate. Same. So clearly it's a different program, but the words trauma sensitive are set apart because it is coming from a specific lensing with specific orientation to that work. And so what that really means is that it came from the Trauma Center, which for anybody listening who may or may not be familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, 20 years ago, he was really looking at how yoga and movement and exercise could be part of his center. It's subsequently spun off as a separate institute, but because it came through that institute, it always was rooted in research. And that means that we have really specific things as teachers or facilitators that we actually do. And they are at this point evidence-based, which is awesome. So I moved away from, just as a personal choice, away from the word yoga, because I generally find that there are folks who love yoga. And there's folks who the first thing out of their mouth is, I'm not flexible, I'm not good at yoga, I hate yoga. So I use the word movement for two reasons. One, because I actually integrate those principles into other pieces of work that I teach. And two, because I do find that the word yoga can actually be quite triggering. But the fundamental base of why I'm using that title is actually related to that designation.
That's awesome. Thanks for explaining that. I love that you've termed it movement because it relates to all sorts of movement, right? Not a specific activity, not a specific exercise. It's just let's move, right?
Let's move.
Why is incorporating movement into daily routines so important? Not just for everyone, right? But specifically for family caregivers. And what are the mental and emotional benefits of utilizing that trauma-sensitive movement for these caregivers?
Yeah. So first I'll start with, I didn't really give a complete definition of what trauma-sensitive movement is. I kind of explained the educational components, but essentially, and the words that I'm about to say sound really simple, but they are really counter to the way that most exercise is taught in our culture. So the number one underpinning is choice. And so with that, I'll just give a really quick example. If I was to be facilitating a class, the cueing might be, if interested, you may choose to move your arm. You might choose to move it forward. You might choose to move it backward. Any speed, any amount. If you're interested, you may wish to shift speeds and try a different speed. See if you can feel a sensation in your arm. So that could be an example of that. Generally speaking, especially if we're looking at a scenario where we are caregiving, and I certainly experienced this myself, we don't have a lot of choice. So that's a really huge piece of why trauma-sensitive movement is so critical and so key for people in that role, because we often feel like this situation has been put upon us. We often clearly love the person that we're doing this work for, but it isn't one where we say, oh, let's wake up in the morning and let's shape my day and let's create kind of the life of my dreams. Quite often, instead, we're working with a scenario where we're pivoting nonstop, where we're kind of cobbling it together and we don't have a lot of choice. So that choice component becomes a huge part of how we're working with this scenario mentally. There's reams and reams and reams of evidence, and you can get, you can get it from your doctor or other practitioners or from Google, but about kind of the benefits of exercise on our mental health. But really that trauma sensitive piece is about experimenting with choice and then being able to do what we call taking effective action. So that means, let's say that we go back to that example of the arm. You move your arm, you realize you don't like it. So perhaps you try experimenting with moving it back and forth. You realize you don't like that. Maybe your arm just needs to rest. And so you can actually pivot what you're doing in your own body's experience based on what your choice level is. And then the other thing that is embedded in it that we know from research is also really effective is rhythm. So when we are caregiving, typically we're under a lot of stress. And again, that doesn't relate to how much we love the person, how much we care about the situation, or anything to do with that relationship. But we tend to have higher stress levels because we have more obligations, we have more responsibilities. We often are, again, kind of out of control. We have more medical confusion sometimes. And so rhythm is one of the things that re-regulates the nervous system. So we know that that's effective. And again, it doesn't need to be this yoga style. Going for a walk is one way that we get rhythm of the pelvis. We get rhythm through music. We get rhythm through dancing. We get rhythm through anything that's sort of repetitive. And it doesn't have to be identical, but when we incorporate movement into the body, we know that that is deeply regulating on the body system. So one of the things, again, that this style of movement instruction or facilitation offers is the opportunity to move outside of just a single plane of motion. So if we go to the gym, we're often going to see people running or coming in a straight line. This often includes a lot of circles and rocking and things like that. And that's something that just in my time facilitating, I notice participants will choose to do. And it often feels really regulating on our spine to move in a circle as opposed to just, kind of sitting in a chair. So there's a lot of different reasons it's helpful. And then I think the last one is what you just said, where we're talking about movement and not exercise. So one of the things that tends to be difficult for everyone, so outside of caregiving, outside of aging together, is finding time for exercise. So because our society has separated exercise as a separate activity from our day-to-day life, I often marvel because I'm like, I think Generation X is probably the first generation in all of human history that literally doesn't need to move. We don't need to get off our couch to order groceries. We don't need to walk to the store. We don't need to walk to neighbors' houses. We don't need to move at all. So what we have been given as a replacement is formalized, quote unquote, exercise programs where we set aside time in our life. We go to a facility, we do the thing, we come back. We're sedentary. So that's what we would typically call exercise. And that could be like going for a run or getting out your bicycle, but it's a separated activity. So when I'm talking about movement, what I really hope for people is that we can get that day-to-day movement where we are integrating that into our habits, into our chores, into our lifestyles, into our social time, so that it isn't kind of like, oh man, I have this caregiver burden, and then I still have to find another hour to exercise. Like, that's not happening. So how do we actually incorporate movement a little bit more into our day-to-day life so that we can get that choice and that rhythm and those other components that I've kind of shared already?
You made a few points that I want to highlight. The first is the opportunity for choice, right? I think that's a big part that doesn't get touched on very often. And unless you've been there or you work with people who have been there day in and day out, you don't realize how little choice people in those positions have, right?
Yeah.
That is something that at the hospital level, we try to do with our patients, right? We understand they're stuck in the hospital. They don't really have a whole lot of choice of who's entering their room, what information they're giving them, what tests they have to do. But, you know, in our sessions, it's more of like, would you like to do this? What would you like to do? Right. And it's a little more options and choice that they're given. And so I love that that's incorporated into this. It gives them a sense of choice and individuality in that, right?
And I think actually, I love the examples you just gave because I think it's worth saying choice within a structure. So in my facilitation, it's an A-B choice. Perhaps it's ABC. It isn't kind of just like find your yoga mat and then it's this open choice, which is really overwhelming for people. So just knowing that choice is often kind of like two things that might be really small on the surface, but that helps our body from feeling trapped and stuck and just like roped into this corner that we can't get out of. And that's part of how we get traumatized.
Yeah, structured choice. I mean, I think that's a great way to term that, right? It's you have this environment that you're in, and now you have these two options or three options. Let's pick what feels right to you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's great. The second point you mentioned was rhythm. And I just want to bring this back to kind of, there's so much research and intervention that goes into rhythmic soothing, right?
Yeah.
Rocking, swaying. Obviously, dance is a big one, but really those gentle movements, right? Rocking and swaying are known to be soothing movement for children with developmental disorders. And we know that. We know that if you've worked in sensory gyms, if you've worked in sensory processing, if you've worked with pediatrics in any case. And so why are we not translating that to humans in general, right? I think their bodies might just need it more for regulation. But when we're in those periods of high stress and high anxiety, we also need that regulation. So why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? Right?
It's true. I mean, I think when it comes to the history of exercise, you don't have to look that far back in history. And we really were doing a lot more. So we were rotating more, we were walking more, we were doing a lot more of those rhythmic exercises. So when you really dig into like, where did a gym come from and how did we get bodybuilding and weightlifting and things like that? Those were really add-on activities. They were not kind of, this is the only movement that you're doing in a day. And they were effectively structured towards an outcome that was to give you big muscles, or in the case of aerobics, it was to, it came alongside the idea that women needed to have a certain body shape, or et cetera. So they were really, what we know as exercise is quite often really specifically intended to shape the body a certain way. And I think that is worth saying, because what we have to look at in all circumstances where we're moving or exercising, what's the underlying intention? What are we trying to accomplish? So in this case, in this conversation that you and I are having, it's really to help regulate yourself. It's to help your nervous system. It's to help your stress levels. It's to help you be more functional. It's to help give you choice. It's to help you have a higher quality of life in this season of life. So we're not necessarily talking about like losing weight or trimming your body fat or building muscles. Now, you might do those things as kind of a side effect, but that's part of why this ends up looking so different, because we really are looking at what's the function of what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to connect to sensation in the body. We're trying to actually feel our bodies. We are trying to make good choices. We are trying to regulate the nervous system. And so that's a really different underlying intention. It doesn't mean that the other one is wrong. It just means that I think that often when we look at where exercise came from, it was developed, I'll put that in quotations, at a time when humans were fundamentally more active, and it was really intended to give a certain body shape, body size, body mass, etc. That's not what this is. And we know so much more about the brain than we used to. So in the 1990s, when MRI technology came along, we can literally look inside a brain and see what stress does to a human body. It isn't a mental process. Like, there is stuff happening in our brain. There's different centers of the brain that light up. And we know now what that does long-term to a person's health. So I think you absolutely nailed it. Why are we reinventing the wheel? And this technique that I'm facilitating and teaching, we're not, right? Which is a nice thing. We can take all those pieces of research and incorporate them into these tools for people so that we aren't taking something and saying, oh, this is totally new. It's totally different. Nobody's ever known about this before, because we have known about this before. We're just kind of taking those pieces and saying, how do we make this functional for somebody who has that trauma exposure, who's encountering stress, emotional difficulties in circumstances that are not ideal? And how do we use those to create more functioning, more capacity, more emotional release, more connection to the body?
You mentioned earlier that these family caregivers, when they have so much on their plate, they're like, how do I take out this time, this extra time, right? What are some common barriers in your experience that you've noticed that family caregivers face when they're trying to include movement into their day? And how can these caregivers balance their own self-care with the demands of caregiving?
I laugh because I remember taking a course myself, and, there's pages in a booklet that are called self-care. And I was just like, I'm going to stab these pages because it's like, that's not a real thing, right? So in my opinion, I think self-care is necessary, but I also think it takes an incredible amount of resourcing and structure around you to kind of carve out what we would call self-care. So it is really challenging to take your spa day or to, even sometimes take a bath. So that's part of why I really lens through, let's make this small, let's make this tiny. So the body doesn't need an hour to kind of experience a moment of shift. The body doesn't need an hour. Is nice if you can get it, but we can do that in an instant. And a lot of that is really about noticing and naming. There are other practitioners who work with breath as an example. So if we have one moment where we can kind of sit, take a breath, notice the shift in the body, that is a moment of self-care. So that's kind of the first thing that I want to say. When it comes to barriers, there's a ton of them. One of them is probably the biggest one that I know of. It's just capacity. And so capacity can look like a lot of different things. Energy is often a huge one. So I'll kind of circle back to that in a moment, but that also encompasses time. It encompasses caring, function. So how do we kind of find time, or the notion that we should do this in our calendar? So capacity becomes, to me, really the single biggest issue, and that there's kind of those micro pieces to it. But what most often happens is that our brain can only hold so many things that we need to do. I believe the research says it's about 7. And I often found myself saying, my brain slots are full. By the time I make a doctor's appointment and then figure out the different pieces, in my case, is dealing with a child, but it's, the different school pieces and the doctor pieces and the my work pieces and the where I need to be and where everybody needs to be. Brain slots full, done. And my nervous system just kind of would shut down. And I would stop retaining data. I would kind of dissociate. etc. So that was my capacity and kind of how I manage some of that. That might look different for different people. So I think that also baked into this work, and I talked about it a little bit without kind of bringing it up, is something called interoception. So that's really reading your own body. So for people with previous trauma exposure, we might dissociate. We may have no information when we go to look there, but that's one of the great pieces about movement. When we're moving the arm, there's something concrete to tap into. So quite often, that's where I also lose the plot with breath work and why I'm not a breathwork teacher. So if I'm sitting in a chair and I breathe in and breathe out, I don't have anything to kind of anchor myself to there. That is effective for some people. They can feel a huge shift with breath. Maybe the nervous system changes with their breath. So for me, I like the movement because it's something concrete. I can feel my shoulder. Oh yeah, there's a little pivot there. And it could be a sensation. It could be something like I just said, where it's like, oh, I can feel the pivot, or I can feel the ball in the socket or the muscle. If you do no exercise and no movement, that's actually where I'd start. It's like 20 seconds twice a day. Can I feel my body? Can I feel my arm? Can I feel my breath? Can I feel my leg? And starting with, can you feel? Because it's really hard to actually take effective action on the body and say, I need more rest, or I need to pause, or I need this, or I need that, if we have no idea what's happening inside to this. And so then you can build from there. So what I eventually kind of found for myself was that I needed to get up in the morning at a time when nobody else was awake, and actually give myself that time. Now, that required going to bed earlier. But I found that what would happen is once my day got started, the snowball would happen, the stress would build. I didn't have the capacity to do it. So we have to remember at all times that our nervous system is actually a super huge component. Another of my trainings is actually specific to the vagus nerve. So that term may or may not be familiar to you, but essentially it's more or less is running the show in our body. So our nervous system state will really inform whether we're shut down, whether we're overactive, or what is happening. So we have to kind of start to be able to tune into, I'm, in a state where I am not calm, I'm not regulated. But to do that, we need to be able to tune into our body. So I wouldn't start with something where it's like, I have to do this big self-care program. I have to take an hour. I think for me, and certainly in my experience, my clients' experience, the more we have to kind of divorce ourselves from the situation in order to calm, regulate, function, the less sustainable that situation is, because then we have to have a whole system to support. How do I get to the spa? Who's going to care for this person? How am I going to get there? There's a whole bunch of executive functioning pieces that have to play in. So if you're lucky enough to have that, that's great. I know that there's programs that include respite care for the care worker, et cetera. So I'm not saying don't do it if you have that. But if you don't, I think that becomes the barrier for a lot of people. And then you just think, okay, I'm not going to meditate. I'm not going to breathe. And it should be said too, just in the research that I'm aware of, meditation and breathing are actually more advanced techniques. So if you do have kind of those nervous system pieces where you get dysregulated and you dissociate, it's really hard to meditate. It's really hard to do breathing. So the simplest technique that I know is just, can I feel my stomach? Can I feel my leg? Can I feel my arm? And that can be that's it. And if you can move one of those pieces, great. You've done movement for the day. And then see if you notice that there's a slight shift in the body. That's all you need to start with. And I found for myself that the more I did that, the more I wanted to do that. So, if you're not experiencing that, then try something else until you kind of get that. And I'm not suggesting I really, really am not suggesting that you're going into the bathroom doing squats while you're brushing your teeth and start multitasking like that. But it's just knowing that, you don't need to set everything aside and carve out that hour or leave your house or go and, do these really special big things. It can just be taking that time. Let's say a doctor comes into the room for your caregiver and you might just be like, I feel fatigue right now. Okay, great. Check. Right?
Yeah. Fatigue is such a big piece of it, I feel like we don't address that as much either, but even mental fatigue on top of the physical fatigue, right? It's just one more thing you have to think about or incorporate into your day. It's almost out of sight, out of mind, right? You're I'm not going to spend my energy, the little bit I have left, on this thing, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I love the concept of integrating it into day-to-day stuff, right? Like, yes, you're not asking them to go into the bathroom and do squats while they're brushing their teeth, right? But like for me, while I'm standing there washing dishes, it's like, I just like to do some like toe raises, right? Because like one, it makes me move instead of standing there for 10 minutes while I'm trying to do this, right? For me personally, like it helps me not have back pain after I'm done because I'm standing in one spot for 10 minutes and leaning over the sink, right? So it just like helps kind of regulate more of that from the muscle side of it. But it's also just like walking around, like taking meetings while you're walking around or while you're talking on the phone with a doctor. Maybe you can like move around your room, right? So it's kind of whatever feels natural almost. Like if you can do something simultaneously, then great. If you can't, then that's okay too. But it's really like, what can you do simultaneously that feels natural?
Yes. So that is actually a strategy that's called temptation bundling. So it's often doing something we like with something we don't like. And so what you get a chance to do when you do that is to automate it. So that is super key because when you automate it, it means that there's no decision left to be made. So one thing I started doing during that phase of my life was calling a friend when I was taking a walk. So you gave that great example of doing it, you know, when the doctor comes in the room, you just go into the hallway and walk, or you stay in the room and you just pace or whatever it is that you do. So if you do that each time, then you don't have to make that decision. So that is one of the pieces about fatigue. And then I will share this as well. I think especially when it comes to exercise programs, again, this is a cultural piece that we're kind of conditioned to do. Is we do 7 or 8 or 10 things at one time. So you change your diet and you start going to the gym and you do this and you do that. Those programs, again, are often meant to create a result, and it's often extreme body changes of some kind. So again, we're not doing that. What I did for myself, and I recommend this to everybody, is to do one thing for about 3 months. So let's say you try the strategy that you just gave, which is every time there's a doctor on the phone, or obviously it's harder if it's like a video call, but you know, every time there's a doctor in the room or on a call, I'm just going to stand up. Let's say you do that. So you try that for 3 months and see if you notice a difference in your body. You might not. And without any pressure of an outcome, which is also part of trauma sensitive work. It's like, well, let's just see what happens. And then if you like that and it's working for you and it's sustainable and you do not have to think about it, then you can try adding something else. So it's really, really important, because when I remember looking at kind of that page of self-care, there's like all these different things. And then it just felt overwhelming. It overloaded me. It was some things I didn't like or didn't want to do, but I can't do 7 things. So it's like, okay, let's try this. And then I found over the course of the year, because I did start to feel better, I felt like I was a little bit less burdened. I was a little bit happier. I was a little bit less stressed. I could add new things a little bit faster than kind of 3 months. So over the course of the year, I did add some things. And then what I also did is I wrote them down. So that when my brain was in like, oh, you know, I'm freaking out. I've lost the plot again. I could open up my, you know, I keep it digitally, but I could open up the little menu that I had of things that I already knew worked and that I had already done and that I had slowly incorporated them in. And I want to be clear that for myself, there was things that got scrapped. Like it took too much time, it took too much money, it took too much energy, whatever it was, it didn't work. But things where I was like, oh, over the course of experimenting with this, it did make a difference to my life. Now I'm overwhelmed again. What of these can I actually implement? And then I think it's also important within that to do some preventative strategies. So my favorite thing in the world, because I'm like type A and kind of black and white, is to do the thing until I don't need to do the thing anymore. And then I set it all aside and then I wait for the next crisis and then I fix it again. So I really had to learn, like, I actually, at this point, I get up in the morning, I do my own trauma sensitive practice. And I do that every day, whether I think I need it or not, whether I think that it's required that day or I think I have time. Because what that does for me is it brings my nervous system into a regulated state to start each morning. And it changed my life because once I started doing that preemptively, then I didn't have to wait for like that crisis circle. Now, I do want to mention, I think that's a little bit more of an advanced strategy. So if right now you're like in burnout and you're in overwhelm, you're just like, this is crazy. There's just no way I can kind of put this in. That's not the place to start. We're not kind of doing preemptive strategies when we're in a crisis. So that's when you've kind of, for me, that was when I had already spent that year experimenting. I found some strategies. I wrote them down. I kind of have a little menu. Some of them take more time. Some of them are big blocks of time. Some of them are things that I can do like right now. And then I actually made sure in there to kind of build that in. So it's worth saying, you know, this could take a year or year and a half to kind of get all of the pieces in place and to find the things that work for you. Because even as an instructor of kind of these techniques, it wasn't like, oh, this is the yoga practice that I do. This is where my arm is. This is how it goes. So, you know, I've been doing this work for 20 years and it was still a year and a half process for me. So I think that, you know, hopefully that brings somebody comfort. And I think part of it at the time when I started, it was like, oh man, like I have a year and a half process on myself in front of me in addition to all this other stuff. Like that's crazy. But just breaking it down into it's one tiny thing at a time where you've got that choice. And then I was really tuning into like, how did this impact me so that we can start to fit those pieces in. And again, just really important to set aside anything that is not working for you. It doesn't matter what an expert or what a research paper says. You know, if going for a walk or taking a run exhausts you, that's a no, right? Let's find something else that doesn't do that to you.
Yeah, it's really important to highlight that what works for someone might not work for you, right? That's just the beauty of humans. What works for one person may not work for another person. And that's so important. I think a lot of us put that stress on ourselves of saying like, hey, this is tried and true. It's trusted. It's research. It's evidence-based. Like we know it works. We should do it. But that requires a lot of doing things you don't want to do, doing things that don't make you feel better, right? When that's the purpose of it. And then doing things just because the papers are telling you that it's good for you.
And I think when it comes to, does it make me feel better? It isn't like a minute by minute thing. That's right. And that's part of why I suggested kind of look at that over a longer period of time. It's the same way that if your loved one tries a new medication, it's not like waking up the next day and being like, oh, that didn't work, right? We don't do that in other areas, but we'll often do it with exercise and movement. So just knowing that, you know, you kind of have to lens that through, how did that go this week? How did that go in this 2-week period? How did that go this month? And then giving some room for some grace, which is so hard to do. And then knowing that also, even if it works for you today and in this season, you may shift it later because you're going to evolve too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to actually bring back a little bit to something you mentioned earlier, because I also feel pretty strongly about this, but self-care journals, right? Like the self-care mantra of like, take a day off, go do a spa day, go get your nails done, all of that. And I really feel like that's like putting a bookmark in your book, right? Like I really feel like it's like, okay, you're putting a pause on something, you're taking care of yourself, which is great. I don't think that that's wrong to do that. I think it's great. But then when you get back, you take that bookmark out and you keep going from right where you left off, right? It's temporary. Whereas I really feel kind of based on what you're explaining, it's like this is meant to be more of a long-term sustainable plan of action so that maybe you don't have to rely on those temporary fixes to feel better or to feel good or to improve your stress response or your nervous system, right?
Totally. At the end of it, one of my key kind of passion points is that we live inside our body. So that's just a fact for all of us. So every single experience we have is coming in through our body. It doesn't hit our mind first. Typically it hits, you know, it's your skin and your muscles and your tissues and all of your senses and your eyeballs and, you know, all of it. So if the only way that you can have a regulated nervous system is to get out of that body situation and to change the situation so dramatically. And again, I love a spa, but if we can only feel our nervous system relax when we're at the spa, we're going to really struggle to kind of come to compassion and acceptance of the things around us and the situations that we're in, because our body is in that most of the time. And so I feel that, just broadly speaking, every single exercise session that I facilitate, it's really like we're in our body, so, and there's no escaping it. And man, humans try, we try,
yeah,
we just try. So I think that's really highlight, underline, asterisk, is if you feel like the only place that you're safe or that you can calm down is to escape, we really need to dial that into a different place where we can actually be here. And it doesn't mean that people think that every situation is fun or enjoyable or that it's, stress-free. That's not true. But finding self-care to me isn't about going to a practitioner or escaping out of the situation or having to leave it, because to your point, eventually we have to come back. Even if you get a week off, you're going to come back, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then your body and your nervous system and your tissues and your senses are still taking in the thing that you're trying to get rid of. And so that's part of, again, kind of the root of trauma work, is coming to a place of acceptance, self-compassion, and just really being in the situation, feeling our body, feeling our sensations. Again, not always pleasant, but then once we're there, then we can root into self-care in that moment. And again, it may not look glamorous and fancy, and it probably doesn't involve nail polish or, but that's where I think some of that stuff can get confused in a way. So to me, self-care is, even if you're in the worst situation that you just want to get out of, can you actually stay in the situation? Can you feel and connect to your body? Can you take a breath? Can you do movement? Can you stand up? Can you feel your nervous system downshift? Can you respond in a way that is not overreacting or underreacting? Can you be here and not in a coping strategy or in dissociation? And that stuff for me also took a lot of work, because I had to undo patterns that I had well in advance of caregiving that I had developed at other points in my life. And none of this stuff is easy, but that is also where movement for me is just such a therapeutic, healing place, because that's the only space in my day sometimes when I'm like, I feel regulated.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting what you said about undoing stuff, right? I almost see it as unlearning some of the things we were taught growing up, right? If I'm in a situation that makes me uncomfortable, my body's reaction is to move my leg, right? Bounce my leg up and down. And it's just helps me stay present and figure out the situation. But growing up, it was a constant stop shaking your leg. You're moving the table. You're moving the chair. Stop shaking your leg. And it's I can't help it. That is just, it's keeping me here and it's allowing me to think through this situation. Right. And so it's unlearning that to be no, it's fine. If I'm shaking my leg, if it's bothering you, I'll move somewhere else. Right. But
totally.
Or I'm going to completely move and leave the situation, and then we're not going to be able to address the situation at all. Right. And so it's really interesting to hear you say that, because it really feels like that sometimes. It's it's okay if I'm fidgety or if I'm moving around, because that's my body's way of keeping me calm. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, there's a trauma professional named Peter Levine, people may or may not be familiar with, but he has been in the field for at least 40 years. And he has written multiple books. They're all super good, but he has a book called Waking the Tiger. And he really just talks about how animals process stress and trauma, and movement is huge in that. So if you ever see a horse immediately after it's run a race, it is not still. It doesn't sit down and, and think, oh man, that was tough. I'm going to watch some TV. They move. So they're rhythmically gyrating. And again, it's kind of circular. And we're not horses, but he goes through a number of different animal species and just reminds us all that we are fundamentally animals. So we have this huge brain, but we are animals and we will have animal responses to things. And one of the things that we know from trauma research is that quite often humans will reenact the same coping strategies. So when we are overwhelmed, we will perhaps shop. Perhaps we will emotionally eat. Perhaps we will dissociate and feel that kind of foggy brain. Perhaps, like yourself, you come into movement. That's actually a regulating strategy. So what we have to really do with some of that unlearning, and, this one might be an area where you would actually want to call in a practitioner, but is it a healthy coping strategy or is it an unhealthy coping strategy? So I would obviously I'm biased, but I would make a strong argument that movement is going to be a healthy coping strategy. Eating healthy foods is going to be, because sometimes we notice we're depleted. And so it's like, okay, let's eat some vegetables. Great. But if what we're doing is eating even carrots to kind of emotionally regulate ourselves, maybe not as much. But a lot of the coping strategies that we do are just, it's a way to keep our organism alive. It's a way to re-regulate. We know things like shopping, for example, we're going to get that dopamine hit. Or another really popular one is just like peace out and go on to social media. We're going to get that dopamine hit. It makes our brain feel different. We do find that somewhat regulating. But we also know when we stick a brain into an MRI machine, we're not actually resting or relaxing when we're doing those things. And it's very temporary. So we're kind of counterbalancing one nervous system state with something else. And it's not really re-regulating us. It's just we're like a pinball game. So, some of the things that we have been told not to do, like moving your leg, I would say that's probably a good coping strategy. If we're doing other things, especially when they start to be somewhat detrimental, like I've given this example a couple of times, but if you're shopping and you're like, oh my God, I'm financially stressed. Well, maybe that's a good area to be like, why am I doing this? And the answer probably is that it's a coping strategy and that's a way that you regulate yourself. And then you're really going to want to look at other ways to do that. And again, if you're like, okay, maybe exercise would be good. It might take you a long time to actually fully shift into that. And it's going to take a lot of awareness and it's a lot of work. It's something that's totally worth doing. But I often think that what happens is we come into these caregiving situations as adults most of the time. And that means we're bringing that whole set of baggage with us. So whatever we haven't processed is going to come up. Whatever traumas we have from our childhood, probably going to come up, especially if we're caregiving family members that were involved in that. And so it's a weird time to suggest that somebody kind of start some of this work. But I would say that it's, as somebody who did that, it's a rewarding time as well, because again, not to add stuff to people's plates, but I think when we can kind of get out of that web of coping strategies and those learned behaviors that did serve us when we needed them less, I think that you kind of emerge through a pathway that feels more connected and more balanced, and your nervous system is happier, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like we may have convinced a lot of people to start with small movements in their day-to-day, right?
I hope so.
How can we ensure, or how can they ensure that the movement that they're practicing is safe and effective?
Safety to me really is about that interoception, where you're tuned into your body. And again, it's a bit learned, but a lot of it's instinct. So the word that I frequently use with my clients and students is injurious. So as long as the movement isn't injurious, we're probably good. If you can't tell, maybe back off. But something that might feel injurious, just as an example, if you bend your knee, you may feel a stretch in the muscle. You also might feel something where your body's like, stop now. Like, this is not okay. So that latter one may be in the injurious range. And I mean, there's a couple of different things. And again, that's where you may choose to just rely on a practitioner just to get things checked or to assess that. But fundamentally, don't do things where your body's screaming no. This is certainly not the time of your life to be enacting like this huge mental push over top of your body. And I think just in general, trauma-sensitive work is where there isn't that hierarchy between my brain rules my body, or my body rules my brain, or the instructor rules my body. So it's really kind of coming to that unity where, like, yes, you're probably going to have to get your brain to be like, hey, let's do this thing. But it shouldn't be kind of pushing your body around. So in terms of safety, it's really tuning in and just stopping if something feels wrong, bad, no good, getting a professional opinion if you're not sure. In terms of efficacy, again, we're looking at function. And the function in this case is going to be, do I feel better? Am I more capable of being regulated? Am I getting less frustrated, or am I sleeping better? Or, insert whatever it is for you. And these shifts might be a bit subtle. So they're not going to necessarily take away the challenges that you have, but it's just like, okay, am I able to function with a slight bit more energy, or a slight bit more ease, or a slight bit of mental clarity? And for me, it was, it's certainly like, I'm a person, I can just get flustered. I'm like, all of this stuff, and I just felt a little bit less flustered, and I could actually be like, okay, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. Whereas before, it kind of was just like this ball of stuff that would be like, all of it now,
Yeah.
And so everybody's going to kind of come into this in a slightly different situation and a slightly different kind of way that they cope with that sort of stress or overwhelm or fatigue or whatever it is. So just looking at like, to me, everything is really based on function. It's not like a quote unquote result. It's is this serving my bodily organism? And we know generally that exercise and movement does. So then if the answer is no, in this one case, I would say, look around for try something else, experiment, because we know generally that humans are meant to exercise. There's a couple things just in general that we as human beings have as essential needs. We need connection and community. We need food and water. We need exercise. We can't sit on the couch for our whole life and be healthy, happy, and regulated. That's just not a thing. So if any of those things are kind of coming up as, I can't tell, or I don't know, give yourself permission to just experiment.
I like that. So going further into all the people we've now convinced to do this, what resources or support systems are available for caregivers who are looking to learn more about these trauma-sensitive movement, or specialists or providers, wherever it might be?
Yeah, so I work in Canada, and there is a huge body. So the specific school that I went to is based in the United States. It's in the Boston area, I believe. And so that's the first thing I would personally Google is trauma-sensitive yoga or trauma-sensitive movement, and just see what practitioners are available near you. Some of us practice online as well, so that is a possibility. If you can't find that, or there's no one near you, because there's only a few hundred of us in the world, move into... Again, there's a whole range of different kind of solutions or practitioners. So I would personally recommend trauma-informed, at least. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be movement. I know one of the tools that I relied on when I was first kind of in the weeds was actually massage. So very similar kind of, there's some overlap between exercise and massage. But that helped me jump a little bit over the hump to, this feels good in my body. So if you can find a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive massage therapist, perhaps a acupuncturist, a body worker of some kind, if exercise just feels like a little bit too big of a leap, again, knowing that typically those are delivered in the sort of 1 hour modules where you do have to kind of separate and carve out. There are definitely some resources online. So I would look into that and see if it appeals. And knowing that typically when we see videos, I know there's podcasts as well for the trauma-sensitive yoga, they're going to skew on the more gentle end. So listen to that as well, because there are people that I have as clients who they want to punch things, they want to run, they want to get that big energy out of the body. So being really clear on what it is that you need, because trauma sensitive does include all of those things, but what we see most in the model that is available at the moment is it is often served up as this like very gentle, calming, soothing practice. If that isn't appealing, especially if you can find a practitioner, we can all adapt that work to somebody who wants to punch a thing too. So, I think, and there are books that are available specific to trauma-sensitive yoga. They are written by David Emerson, and he is the founder of this work who worked with Bessel van der Kolk. So I would definitely recommend that book. And then again, if you're like, I'm not quite ready to exercise, but I do like reading, I would recommend Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. That's where we really learn about like how our body holds everything. If you're kind of interested in a few of the nervous system resources, I would move towards Stephen Porges. He's the founder of the polyvagal theory, and that really talks just about where our nervous system goes. For his work, his books are really quite academic. So personally, I would look up some podcasts. So I would read Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's book. I would listen to Stephen Porges's podcasts. If kind of that animal connection spoke to you, Peter Levine is amazing. I've also studied with Gabor Mate. He really talks about kind of those coping strategies. So if that one kind of spoke to you, Gabor has videos, podcasts, books. He kind of does everything. And then, movement specific, I would really dig into. I often find that my clients have life-changing results in 3 sessions. So this isn't something where you need to kind of hire a personal trainer for the rest of your life. It's just getting kind of a few tools, a few strategies, practicing them, enacting them. So if you're interested in speaking to me, I work both in person in Calgary as well as digitally. And my business is called My Body Couture. So you can find me at the .com or on the social media sites, and I'd be happy to help with other resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we wrap up, I really would like to hear a success story of someone you've worked with. I'm sure you've got many, but is there one that has stood out to you throughout your time working with these caregivers or families?
Yeah, I have been teaching at a center that specializes in pregnancy and infant loss. And many of the women at that center actually have children as well. So they are both caregiving young children as well as processing the loss and the grief of it's everything from infertility to children born at term that passed away. And so it is transformative in terms of the experience that I've witnessed, that even on a day-to-day level, when class begins, there's a heaviness, there's grief, there's sorrow and loss in the people's bodies. And when they leave, there's a lightness and a connection that they can make with each other. And just noticing how they're living their lives in between the sessions, where they're able to be more joyous and be able to connect more with people around them and ask for, even actually during that particular session, they're able to lean on each other and ask for help in different ways. And just, there's constant feedback there that there's a lightness and a fluidity to their bodies, which I think just creates so much more capacity. So that's a really specific example without kind of giving away people's histories. But, I would say actually in my own house, I'm my best transformation story, because really doing this work transformed the health of myself and as well as my child. So it crosses the chasm for people in terms of what that result or success story looks like. But typically what happens is it lightens and brightens people's loads, and they can connect more, they can ask for help more, they actually are able to rest more when they need it, or to know when to push more. And it creates just clarity in people's lives that they didn't have before.
So wrapping up, what is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to movement, exercise, family caregiving, trauma sensitivity, kind of the whole gamut?
I think a couple things. I know you said one, but movement and exercise are different. And so just embracing that idea that movement is going to be life-changing, and then knowing that we don't have to kind of carve out time and that we can move in little ways, ideally is really helpful for people. But I think the main thing, I often will give presentations to therapists, and we'll kind of work with clients together. Every single therapist that I've ever met with completely agrees with this. We cannot move through our emotions sitting in a chair. So yes, we can do a lot in therapy. We can do a lot at a doctor's office sitting in a chair. We can do a lot with medication. We can do a lot in a lot of ways, but we can't fully close that integration cycle until we move. And so that it's the number one piece that people will that'll be the first thing out the door, where they're like, I don't have time, I don't have energy, I don't have capacity, but it's actually the first thing that we kind of need in order to close that loop. So if you are caregiving, trying to help another person trying to juggle and balance the load, which is, it's dramatically big. We can't fully close that and continue looping and cycling until we actually add movement in. And there's, we've given kind of some of the scientific reasons for that, but that's an area where therapists agree. I agree. Research agrees. And you'd be pressed to go survey the world and find, anybody who disagrees with that. So I think we've all heard that kind of exercise message banged over our head. And there's lots of reasons we avoid it. But if we can kind of think like, okay, I'm not going to be doing my best for my loved one or for myself until this back half or quarter or whatever it is of that cycle is something that I undertake, knowing that actually might help us get there. And it shouldn't be this big chore, but we have to do it.
I love that. I feel like you can make a correlation there where it's like exercise is movement, but movement is not necessarily exercise.
Yes, exactly right. Right. Yeah. But, and that movement is really what we need in order to like regulate and be helpful and have energy and to give our best to the world and ourselves.
Yeah. Awesome. Janis, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I think you did a phenomenal job of highlighting the importance of incorporating movement into our daily lives. And I really hope we've spoken to at least someone listening who could really benefit from it so that they could, improve their own lives.
Thank you so much for having me.
To all my listeners, thank you for tuning into this month's episode with Janis Isaman. If you would like to learn more about Janis, you can find her on LinkedIn and YouTube under her name. For her company, My Body Couture, please visit mybodycouture.com or use @mybodycouture on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, and Substack. Sharing expert perspectives on various age-related topics and services can help the community learn how to plan for a healthier future. At Aging Together, we are dedicated to helping you navigate aging together. Thank you for tuning into Aging Together. This podcast is brought to you by Aging Together LLC, a private care consulting practice helping individuals and families age with a plan. This episode was produced by me, Dr. Pooja Patel, in partnership with Natural Eye Media. If you found this episode of Aging Together valuable, we'd love your support in spreading the word. Your likes, shares, and reviews fuel our mission. Don't forget to rate and leave a review wherever you're listening. Your feedback matters. Until next time, take care.